Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Will Hayward, and I'm the Dean of Social Sciences at the University of Hong Kong. I'll be introducing our speaker tonight, and my colleague, Dr. Courtney Fung, who's Assistant Professor of Politics and International Relations, will help moderate the discussion afterwards. On behalf of the Faculty of Social Sciences and the Asia Global Institute at Hong Kong U, along with our co-organizers Bright Hong Kong and the Association of Pacific Rim Universities, it's my very great pleasure to welcome you here this evening. We're going to spend time in the company of a pivotal global figure of the last half century. His Excellency José Ramos Horta grew up in the Portuguese colony of East Timor. As you will know, Timor is an island in Southeast Asia where during colonial times the west half was part of the Dutch East Indies, eventually becoming part of the nation of Indonesia, and the east half was claimed by the Portuguese. As the colonial hold-on nations weakened, a turbulent politics emerged, and despite his young age, or maybe because of his young age, Mr. Ramos Horta became very politically active. And in 1974, the Portuguese Revolution saw East Timor able to pursue self-determination for the first time in centuries, and Mr. Ramos Horta was appointed foreign minister at the ripe old age of 25. However, shortly afterwards, East Timor was invaded by the Indonesian army, and Mr. Ramos Horta would spend the next 25 years abroad advocating East Timor's case before the world and bringing international attention to the plight of his people. For this extraordinary work, he shared the Nobel Peace Prize in 1996 with his countryman, Bishop Ximenes Bello. Remarkably, by 2000, he succeeded in negotiating an international settlement which saw Indonesia return sovereignty of East Timor to its people. And in 2002, Mr. Ramos Horta became the founding foreign minister of the new country of Timor-Leste, before assuming the role of prime minister and then president of his country, a position he held from 2007 to 2012. Since he stepped away from government, Mr. Ramos Horta has been a very active international citizen and global diplomat, and we had the pleasure of spending an hour in his company just now with some students and hearing all about the very many activities that he's been involved in. So to give a full listing would take us all night. But just to highlight a few, he served on many UN bodies, such as the High-Level Board on Mediation and the Global Commission on Drug Policy, and he's been an external advisor to the President of the UN General Assembly. Highly relevant for our discussion tonight, he's been chair of the high-level panel on UN peace operations, which was a worldwide review of the UN peacemaking and mediation efforts. And he's also played a key role on behalf of the UN in a lot of different areas of the world, including maintaining stability in the West African nation of Guinea-Bissau. At the University of Hong Kong, we seek to imbue our students with a commitment to improving the lives of people around them and acting for the greater good rather than simply pursuing their own interests, because it's only by acting together that we will achieve the greatest benefits for our societies overall. The way we describe this in simple terms is that we want to achieve impact, which means venturing outside the safe world of the campus and seeking to make real change in our communities. There's no one better suited as a role model for his positive impact on both local and global communities than our guest tonight. So I'm truly honored to invite His Excellency José Ramos Horta to speak to us tonight on the theme of peace and world security, building a new international dialogue.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the kind invitation extended to me to be here today to share with you my simple reflections or comments on the state of the world, the role of multilateralism, United Nations system in the midst of these new security challenges that we all know we face in many parts of the world. This is my second visit to Hong Kong. First, I was here in April. I was invited to join a group of Nobel laureates in the field of sciences who were gathering here, and the German Consul General was kind enough at the time to also host launch of my book, Words of Hope in Challenging Times. So, and it was in that gathering that I met Germán Munoz from Mexico, with his wife, who is French. They live here for many years, and we will be leaving soon back to other destinations. And he was evidence of his kind heart, like the big kind heart of many Mexicans, he was so impressed by my book that they encouraged me to come back to Hong Kong, but this time on my way to Bahrain and then to Ghana. I'm going to Ghana for a sad event, and that is to attend the funeral of a great man, Kofi Annan, former Secretary General of the United Nations, one of the best ever serving as Secretary General of the UN. Maybe he belonged to the class of Secretary General of Dag Hammarskjöld of Sweden. In fact, my remarks to you today, I wanted to just to talk with you informally, a form of conversation. But I feel a bit intimidated, and I decide I better read something, because I'm a bit like President Trump. If I don't read from a prepared text, I'm bound to say silly things. And I always end up in trouble. So I decided to borrow from a speech I delivered in Uppsala University in Sweden in 2015. They have this Dag Hammarskjöld annual lecture. And so the topic is about the same, relevant then, obviously relevant today. The world didn't change much since 2015. The difference is that I will not address you, Your Royal Highness, and Rector Magnifica Excellencies. But I made reference to Dag Hammarskjöld, and I said, diplomat, economist, author, Secretary General of the UN, 1953 to 1961. He perished on 18 September 1961, just past midnight, when his DC-6 plane crashed shortly before landing in Ndola, a dot on the map for northern Rhodesia, now Zambia. Till today, can you imagine, an aristocrat, Secretary General of the UN, his plane somehow crashed. And till today, in spite of numerous investigations, no conclusion about the circumstance of his plane crashing. Dag Hammarskjöld was a man of extraordinary intellect and integrity, truly independent-minded. Maybe even back then, many interests in and around Congo were not very interested in Dag Hammarskjöld's determined, stubborn pursuit of peace and independence for Congo. Were the Belgians happy with him? Were the Russians, were the CIA happy with Dag Hammarskjöld? That's the question that remained unanswered for a long time. The cause of Dag Hammarskjöld's death remains shrouded in mystery, just as the murder of US President John Kennedy 2 years later. I am one of probably the most loyal fan of the Kennedys. You go to my country, Delhi, the capital, you look for my house, easy to find. Delhi is not Hong Kong. And please do not confuse Delhi with Delhi. The original name of Delhi is actually Delhi. A friend of mine, a deceased African foreign minister, came to Timor-Leste soon after our independence. He arrived 5 days late. He told me the story. He bought the ticket. He arrived in Delhi. He was very impressed how Delhi, capital Timor-Leste, had a big airport and surprisingly with so many Air India planes. Then he goes inside, Indians everywhere. Obviously, when in India, Indians are everywhere. But he thought maybe because we are under UN administration, maybe these are UN personnel, but unevenly dominated by Indians. And he was puzzled. The Timorese just got free from the Indonesians, and now they're dominated by the Indians. Only outside, when he saw so many Indian beat down taxis, he said something is wrong. He checked his ticket, and it was Delhi. But when you ask back then a ticket to Delhi, well, they send you to Delhi because they never heard of it. And the original name actually Delhi. Delhi, India is Delhi, Delhi, East Timor is Delhi. So please, I invite you to go to Delhi, East Timor. Don't end up spending your money in Delhi, in India. It is fitting that I also pay tribute, I said in that meeting, to another Swedish Count of Wisborg, Folk Bernadotte, diplomat, nobleman, who was the first UN envoy to be sent to the Middle East in 1948 to try to bring about an acceptable solution to all parties, Palestinians, Arabs, and Jews. I mentioned these two-part episodes not only to illustrate UN peace operations, UN effort to bring about to correction of historical injustices. Well, it has been now how many years? No resolution. No resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, no justice to the Palestinians. Justice was done to the Jews after the Holocaust. A land was set aside for them, but the other side, in the equation, the Palestinians, remain unresolved. And the same with Congo. Dag Hammarskjöld died, and today Congo remains literally at war. 5 million children, 5 million children killed in Congo in the last 20 years. Yet, instances of random killing, whether in Paris, in New York, London, news all over the world. And we are outraged. But the death of 5 million children, I'm talking 5 million children, besides adults. And this, the oldest United Nations mission in the world, Congo. Until a few years ago, the figures, I remember, I haven't followed up recently, 20,000 UN personnel in Congo, DRC. I am not unfamiliar with the United Nations. I first arrived in New York in 1975. I had not done really any reading of the UN. I was sent to New York by our newly organized government that came out following the unilateral declaration of independence 28 November 75, Indonesia invasion 75, December 75. I was told by our leader, Nicolau Lobato, a great charismatic individual, to go to New York. Well, to go to New York from Delhi, East Timor, is not like you go from Miami to New York, or from Bali to Jakarta, or from a ferry from Hong Kong to Macau. And he didn't tell me how. He said, you have to go. We had no flights. The Australian government had banned all flights in and out of Timor-Leste for security reasons, because Australian intelligence knew the pending invasion, anytime, any minute. So no Australian citizens were encouraged to stay in Timor-Leste. But sometimes in international relations, like when you read about World War II, when you read about Nazi occupation of France, or when you read about Willenberg, great Swedish diplomat, individuals can make huge difference and save tens of thousands of lives. Raoul Wallenberg, Swedish diplomat, was credited with saving tens of thousands of Jewish lives. Kofi Annan, the recently deceased UN Secretary General, his wife is a niece of Wallenberg. But so have been many others, including a Portuguese consul in Bordeaux, in France. The Portuguese regime during World War II was neutral in World War II, like Sweden, but with some leaning of sympathy towards Nazi Germany in view of the conservative nature of the government in Portugal. But that consul, he saved 30,000 Jewish lives. He issued passports to as many Jews as he could who went on to Portugal. But because he challenged the Portuguese government regime policy, he then was recalled, fired, and died in poverty. And it was a Jewish woman called Anne Treseder, whom I met in California, San Francisco, who began a campaign on that Portuguese consul. And he entered the history of Israel as a friend of the Jewish people. So there are individuals like that. And in that particular case of Timor in 75, I called two friends in Australia, David Scott, Melbourne, deceased, Ken Fry, Federal Member of Parliament, deceased. I asked them, I need a plane to travel to Australia and then on to New York. In the meantime, I start getting prepared to go to the mountains. I put on a camouflage. I pick up a G3, a NATO-issued rifle. Roger East, an Australian journalist from Darwin, whom I recruited to come to Timor-Leste to work with me to set up a news agency, he looked at me and he laughed. Jose, you never fire a gun in your life. You're going to shoot yourself. And he showed me his pen. This is my weapon. While we were talking, a telephone call came from Ken Fry in Canberra to me. He said, be ready, go to the airport, a plane is on its way. So me and other two colleagues, Maria Alcatiri, Roger Lobato, we left. But I didn't forget to take along with me a young Portuguese guy who got stranded in Timor during the Civil War. His name is Antonio José Dona Leocádia Ferreira. I remember his mother, because his mother was a very intimidating, big Portuguese lady. She managed a hotel, a restaurant, a bar, and she always chased us away from the bar. And because we are young, like many of you, so Dona Leocádia, that's her mother. I remember more her mother than the father, who was a more quiet person. And I took him along to Darwin, and he escaped so he is alive. Then, of course, the long route to New York. My introduction to New York was, to the United Nations, was through Salim Ahmed Salim, permanent representative, ambassador of the United Republic of Tanzania. 28 years old then. Later, he became very known and disliked by Washington because he was the one that orchestrated a vote in the UN General Assembly together with other African fellows, including Algeria, to have the seat of China in the UN that was held by the Republic of China, which is Taiwan, replaced by the People's Republic of China. And Salim was seen jumping up and down in the aisle of the UN General Assembly. Many years later, in 1981, Salim was candidate for Secretary General. He was supported by every possible regional bloc in the UN system. African Union, to start with, non-aligned movement, Organization of Islamic Conference, etc., his overwhelming majority. The other candidates were Kurt Waldheim, Austria, who wanted a third term. By then, I was reasonably familiar with the UN. I had already some network built up, and I tried to sound out the votes, how they would go for Secretary General between Salim and Kurt Waldheim. I talked with a senior Soviet diplomat. I just remember his name. He was a Navy captain called Nikolai. Nikolai, how would the Soviet Union vote between Salim and Kurt Waldheim? The Americans are vetoing Salim. He said, we would veto Salim. And I said, do you realize you would be discredited in the eyes of the third world? And he said, what has the third world done for us in Afghanistan? You know, Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan and non-aligned movement condemned. So I told Salim, I said, listen, I don't think you have any chance. If the Americans did not do the dirty job of vetoing you, the Soviets would. But the Chinese also, for first time, the Chinese showed their diplomatic clout at the United Nations. They vetoed they vetoed Kurt Waldheim 16 times because China was supporting Salim. 16 times in a row. Then emerged an African diplomat, Peter Olara Otunu from Uganda, brilliant young diplomat. He became, for the President of Security Council was by rotation, every month, one president. So Peter Olara Otunu was president for the month of December. He asked the two candidates to step aside temporarily for 2 weeks to give him a chance to possibly find an alternative candidate. Both agreed, and they sent message to a not known UN Under-Secretary General who was vacationing in Peru, his home country, Javier Pérez de Cuellar. Would you like to be Secretary General of the UN? Obviously, he would like to. Who wouldn't want? If a phone call would come to any of you in this room today, would you like to be Secretary General of the UN? Would any of you say no? You're not interested. Obviously, you would say yes. Javier Pérez de Cuellar agreed. He became the next Secretary General for 10 years. So this, to illustrate, as introduction, the power play as far back as when the first UN missions And not everything is dictated by cold political, strategic analysis. Not everything come out as neatly as the most brilliant academics of international relations imagine it to be. Sometimes personalities, individuals, even if they might they believe in something else, like in this case, when that plane was allowed to come to Timor-Leste, it was allowed by an Australian acting foreign minister called Andrew Peacock from Melbourne. My two friends called him. You, Jose Ramos Horta, your friend, because in the meantime I became very friendly with Andrew Peacock. He liked me. If you don't send a plane, he cannot leave, and he can be killed. A plane came, authorized personally by Andrew Peacock. If he had checked, Andrew Peacock had checked with Australian intelligence, and they probably would say, no, don't. And this happened again and again. Peter Olara Otunu, brilliant diplomat, he is the one who orchestrated that consensus, that resolution, that deadlock, the resolution of that deadlock. If he had, of course, China would veto again and again, repeated as they did, the re-election of Kurt Waldheim. But assuming Kurt Waldheim had been re-elected, the UN would have found itself, during the third mandate of Kurt Waldheim, a major international scandal. Because soon after, Kurt Waldheim was elected president of Austria, and he was ostracized by every country, in Europe at least, because it was found that, after all, he was serving with the Nazi army in the Balkans, something he hid in his biography, which called In the Eye of the Storm. The UN progressed, and the world progressed or retrogressed since those years when I first went to New York. That was the height of the Cold War, 1975. In 2000, the then Secretary General of the UN, it was Kofi Annan. Kofi Annan was elected in 96 and began to serve in January 97. He commissioned Lakhdar Brahimi, an outstanding Algerian diplomat, to do a report that later became known as the Brahimi Report, to advise the UN system on how to make the UN more relevant in addressing the security challenges the world faced beginning in 2000. But by 2015, as you know, security challenges facing the UN, facing us, changed dramatically in nature and in reach. Up to that time, extremist groups, they use violence. Violence justified either by ideology, because violence was not only justified by ideology, by religion. Baader-Meinhof in Germany, Brigata Rozza in Italy, Action Directe in France. These were extreme left-wing groups, maybe Maoist-inspired. I say Maoist-inspired because they hated the revisionist Soviet Union. So terrorist activities, indiscriminate violent activities were not completely new. They were there. But European security agencies were very effective in picking one by one. But it was not only the security approach and sophisticated were European security institutions, but because simply whoever you espouse ideas whether religious or ideological, that do not find credence, resonance in the society, you are bound to fail. Why those people think Action Directe in France, Red Brigade in Italy, Baader-Meinhof, the German society, the Italian society, the French, the European, would share their dreams of an utopian society built on violence, on killings. So I've said again and again, the fight against extremism, whatever nature, yes, sometimes you cannot be too romantic. You have to use force in confronting some of the evil ideologies that use violence to achieve their aims. Sometimes you have to do that. But any problem that is essentially political, security, social, or religious, you cannot address them through simply security approach. The Europeans won the battle against these groups because of the reality of society, of freedom, of prosperity that Europeans were experimenting. What was the alternative for that? And the same is happening with the dramatic changes taking place in the Middle East. If you look at some countries, for instance, Indonesia, the largest Muslim majority country in the world, 270 million. In every election in Indonesia, secular parties, political parties, win the election with absolute majority. Radical Muslim parties lose. Because the Indonesian society, with more than 100 televisions, 30,000 radios, thousands of newspapers, and the biggest users, percentage-wise, of social media, Facebook, living in today ample freedom after the Suharto era, they know that there can be better alternative what they're living today, but through progress, improving more and more their lives, and not through what is proposed to them by the radical groups. That's why Indonesia has been winning the battle against extremists. And it's surprising that Indonesia, with 260 million people, total estimate of Indonesian citizens fighting with ISIS in Iraq and Syria were about 400 people. France and Belgium have about 2,000. Why? Well, each of us maybe can reflect, or authorities can reflect and explain why. Malaysia, much smaller than Indonesia, had an estimated 700. My point is to illustrate, as again and again, the panel that I chaired with my colleagues, high-level panel on peace operations, in any peace operation mandated by the UN Security Council must bear in mind permanent long-term solutions are political in nature. So no peace operation, a peace enforcement operation can be successful without a political end result. Look at the situation in Mali, and we strongly recommended to the Secretary General, to the UN, to the Security Council General Assembly, the United Nations must not be dragged into fighting terrorism. The UN was not created, was not mandated, and is not trained, not prepared. UN peacekeepers are not prepared for that. But in Mali, the UN ended up being dragged into, and the fight is essentially a non-conventional one, against all UN past experiences in peacekeeping or peace enforcement between insurgents that are mostly social or politically inspired. In Mali, it's completely different. But why the UN ended up in Mali? First, the radical group, well-financed, well-armed, after the implosion of Libya. And then you can understand the problem in Mali, the problem in Europe with refugees, a lot related to the implosion of Libya. And the implosion of Libya, I don't want to simplify it, but had to do with some inclination a few years ago on regime change. Following the Arab Spring, Tunisia first, Egypt, euphoria in UK, in France, Prime Minister David Cameron, Sarkozy went to Libya, received as heroes because they orchestrated the fall of Gaddafi. And Gaddafi had won. After me, you will see millions going to Europe. It's not as simple as that. It's not only Libya, it is Syria, but also extreme poverty in many parts of the Maghreb, North Africa, and West Africa, and so on. But that indicates also failures on the part of the donor countries. Over 50 years of so-called development aid by the West. Why poverty remained widespread in many of the recipient countries? Of course, easy to blame others. Blame the Europeans, blame the donor countries. Blame is to be shared by the two sides. The recipient countries, the elites in the developing world, and the donor countries. If you look at many studies, Oxfam and others, one recent study I saw in The Guardian the other day, foreign aid has been largely a fraud. I wouldn't say that far. I think that is extreme. There might be some countries that are cynical about it, I mean Western countries, but others not. They are genuine. But the policies fail, the strategies fail. And both sides, the sending country and the recipient country. And all of this is what creates this phenomena of refugees flocking to Europe and elsewhere. It's not only the war in Syria, but the failure of the past 50 years of all of us to prevent the breakdown of communities, of society, increasing impoverishment, increasing inequality, and the sense of alienation, the sense of desperation. Because people don't leave their communities, their villages, for the sake of it. They leave, some dreaming of a better life for their children. Others, flee wars. And that's nothing new. China was incredibly poor in centuries past, in generations past. Chinese were dragged as slaves, literally, to work for richer European countries. So Chinese should understand the phenomena of poor people leaving their country in search of better life. And many are coming back to China. Chinese who are in the US or elsewhere. I remember one day I was in California, but that was even before the big Chinese economic miracle. I was chatting with this, taking my laundry to a Chinese laundromat, then chatting with the Chinese lady there. She said, "Oh God, here I work so hard and I make little money. In China, they're getting rich. but she didn't feel like wanting to go back to China after so many years. The phenomenon of refugees today that we observe, well, is nothing new. Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the US, Argentina, Chile, so many of the new countries of the New World are products of the millions of Europeans fleeing extreme poverty in Europe and the religious wars in Europe. This happened centuries ago, and even up to after World War I, before World War II, and after World War II. Today, we see a process in reverse. People from North Africa, elsewhere, that Europeans colonized, visited, are going to Europe. Of course, this sudden encounter creates shocks and new challenges. And Europe is a bit politically in disarray. But there are some extraordinary people in Europe. And one extraordinary person is Angela Merkel, whom I met July 5th in Berlin for 1 hour. If the Nobel Committee in Oslo, in making the decision, you will pay attention, the first Friday of the month of October, when the Nobel Committee announced the winner of the Peace Prize for 2018-19. I hope that in their wisdom, they elect Angela Merkel. Angela Merkel, in times of crisis, extraordinary difficulties, moral, political challenge, dilemma, 2 million refugees knocking at the doors, at the gates of Europe. Hungary, Austria denying entry. Italy, Greece already overwhelmed. They are at the front line. Understandably, many in Germany wouldn't agree with letting the refugees in. She decided we must let in these people. And they came into Germany. She is paying a political price, but I hope it's temporary. Because Merkel saved Europe from betrayal, saved Europe from moral bankruptcy. And she saved Europe from an even greater security challenge if they had not agreed to let in the refugees. Because Turkey, hosting 2 to 3 million refugees and under enormous strain. Jordan, small country, impoverished. Lebanon, not to mention other countries in Asia. How many refugees? Iran, from Afghanistan, Iran had been hosting for years. How many? Malaysia, Indonesia have been hosting. And in the past, Thailand, hosting refugees. When Merkel made the decision, she won extraordinary goodwill in the Muslim world, in Turkey, etc. And she bought time to allow the Europeans to have a coherent strategy to deal with the refugee problem. Today, if you go to Germany, as I have been, I was in Berlin recently. Yeah, there are incident problems here and there, but by and large, largely the process has been smooth. Not all is negative, is pessimistic in the world. My remarks to you might be very sound pessimistic, and even just by the title can be daunting. And in fact, I don't know, I think it was German who, in his Mexican passion and enthusiasm, shows for me this title. I didn't pay much attention, and I agree. Only when I walk in these big letters, I was overwhelmed. peace and world security, building a new international dialogue. I don't have this ambition. This can come only from a passionate Mexican. And so I end here to say, there are extraordinary people. I mentioned Merkel. She is just one extreme example. But there are many simple people around the world. In the United States, in the Trump land, there are extraordinary individuals, known and unknown, who are showing the strength of American democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, I end here. I wanted to speak very little to give you a chance more question and answer, but I have this very bad habit. I'm not able to really discipline myself. When I improvise, I go on and on until the room is empty. And then I realize. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, I should say. My name is Courtney Fung, and I'm a faculty member in the Department of Politics and Public Administration. So I'll be chairing the question and answer session this evening. If I may, I'd like to have anyone who's interested in asking a question, please keep your questions brief. As you can tell, there'll be a very lively discussion for His Excellency. And can you please also introduce yourself and mention your affiliation, if you have any at all, to Hong Kong U. So I open the floor for Q&A. Wonderful, okay. And please do wait for the microphone. So lady there, and then also the gentleman, and then this lady in the front. So 1, 2, and 3, thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Cham Sao Hong, and I was Jose's student. So I'm very proud to say that many years ago in 1991, you were my lecturer with diplomacy training program, and my classmate James is here too. So we're very happy to have you back here. And I think your message of peace is really important, and we all sort of take that with us all these years. My question to you is what do you see, for the region, for your country, for East Timor? What can sort of much better sort of resourced places like Hong Kong, for example, what can we do to assist nation building in East Timor? Thank you.
Please. Then the gentleman who had his hand up, please. Next question. We'll take 3 questions at a time then. Thank you.
I'm Yuing Yin. I am an alumni, and I have also taught at the university, and I have worked at UNESCO and OECD. I would like Your Excellency to comment on the effect of colonialism on peace and security. Over many former colonies in Asia and Africa, even after 40 years of gaining independence, are still suffering from the unconstructive thinking implanted during colonial rule. Also in South Asia, the colonialists have caused the migration of peoples, knowing that they would be in conflict. This would in the strategy of divide and rule. So in the case of Myanmar, and perhaps also you might also comment on your fellow laureate who got the Nobel Prize in Peace. Would you think this is a problem of ethnic conflict, or would you classify this as a problem of decolonization?
Thank you. And then the lady right here, thank you.
My name is Johanna von Petzold. I'm a PhD student in sociology at HKU. I would be interested in what is your perspective on the role of Timor-Leste in the Portuguese-speaking world?
Thank you very much. So, Your Excellency, when you're ready.
Yeah. First, in relation to the question on Timor-Leste, I don't know how many of you are very familiar, but in 2002, when we achieved independence, the country had been thoroughly, physically destroyed. A whole country traumatized. Hundreds of thousands fled in different directions, uprooted away from their homes, uprooted to Indonesia, many to Australia, but primarily to elsewhere in Indonesia. Just to give you an example, upon independence, May 2002, our first national budget was $68 million. For a country thoroughly destroyed, a people traumatized, with endless lists of priorities. Of course, we had generous international support, widespread, from Australia to New Zealand to Japan to China, Europe, Portugal, United States, etc. In 2001, even before independence, we began negotiations with Australia on a new deal concerning the resource sharing in the Timor Sea. And on day one of independence, we signed an agreement called Timor Sea Treaty, whereby not agreeing with Australia on relinquishing our claims to a maritime boundary, permanent maritime boundary, drawn median line between Australia and the Timor-Leste. Not agreeing with that, Australia argued that their maritime boundary would extend beyond the median line because at that time, Australia and some countries argued the old principle of continental shelf, that a coastal state is entitled to a maritime boundary to as far as its continental shelf extends, till the edge of the continental shelf. So if you have a continental shelf that is go well beyond a median line between the two countries, then this is an old principle, and we didn't agree. But not agreeing with that, we didn't want that to completely block an agreement on resource sharing in the Timor Sea. So we went for a creative arrangement based on resource sharing on one particular area called Bayu Undan. There we managed to change the ratio between Australia and Timor-Leste. We changed to 90% revenues for Timor, Timor-Leste, 10% for Australia. By 2004, 2005, oil and gas began to be pumped from Bayu Undan. We established immediately, the Parliament passed a law creating the petroleum law, 2004. 2005, we passed another law creating what they call petroleum fund, which is a sovereign fund. Very new, novel in the world. Probably the only other country that had such sovereign fund was Norway. When I talk about resource-rich countries, whether oil, gas, diamond, or gold. Venezuela doesn't have a sovereign fund. Nigeria never had. Angola, only 5 years ago, after 40 years of having oil and gas, they created a sovereign fund. Well, at independence, we had 19 medical doctors. No electricity, basically, intermittent here and there. 60% of children wouldn't go to school. Well, today, I have to say, we have more than 1,000 medical doctors, of which 700 studied in Cuba, 100% Cuba solidarity, not 1 cent from our side, 400 graduated in Timor-Leste, trained by Cubans. On top of it, we had 250 Cuban doctors working in Timor-Leste, who contributed to today we have almost eliminated malaria. We have still other serious diseases like tuberculosis and other infectious diseases. The Sovereign Fund now has $17 billion. We started with 250 million as deposit, and now we have $17 billion. And so in 2002, as I mentioned, our budget was $68 million. And I personally had to go to Japan, to Portugal, to Sweden, to Washington, London, begging for money. And I thought, God, I did a lot of fundraising when I lived in New York. One of my relief in life was, God, the country is free. Finally, I don't have to lobby anyone. I got back to Timor, and then I have to start all over again, lobbying for money. I hated most this. The Portuguese were the most extraordinarily generous. We never had to argue with them. We needed financial support, direct support to our budget requirements. They said, yes, we will support. Australia was also, but Australia won. Yes, we do some budget support, but the rest is program support, meaning here there is money, but it's for projects that we decide or we implement. Implement how? Through choices of Australian companies, Australian NGOs. For instance, the European Union. I love the European Union. I even nominated the European Union for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2008, 2009, 2010. But you request something to the European Union. It takes up to 4 years before you see some of the money. And it has to be through an European NGO or an European company, or through the implementing agency of an European country. Of course, that implementing agency hire Europeans. And the Europeans demand a special degree of attention. Not like a Timorese or a Filipino or a Bangladeshi. High salaries, and they study and after study and after study. 3,000 studies have done on Timor-Leste over the years. We were psychoanalyzed from every angle. Well, but then 10 years later, we still didn't have electricity. We still didn't. Seriously, we didn't have electricity. No roads. When you travel today to Timor-Leste, you will see electricity almost everywhere. It is our own, financed from our petroleum fund. You will see roads everywhere now being built. I avoid traveling now in my own country because there's construction everywhere. If you don't die from cigarette smoking, and I don't smoke, you will die from the dust, kicked up by, and they say it's worse than smoking. So, and that's from our sovereign fund. Where are the billions that were allegedly allocated to Timor-Leste? I don't know. You ask the Australians, the Japanese, the European Union. Don't ask me. But usually blame the Africans, blame the Timorese. No, there is a difference between budget support, which, yes, we manage it, and one is program support, which they manage. So we, the Petroleum Fund, we became independent, and we start doing what we wanted. Of course, doesn't mean that we know better than everyone else. Well, we also make mistakes. Sometimes we like, instead of 2-lane road, why we need 4-lane road. Why we need electricity right now, the power that we have produce 150 megawatts. in a country that used 50 megawatts. And why didn't we go straight to, renewable energy? Well, some of you would argue, and I argued, well, I'm sorry, but renewable energy is still expensive. And let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, if I were to make a decision today on a whole system of renewable energy, I would not do it. Because technology evolving so fast. What I invest today in an expensive renewable energy, solar or wind, will be obsolete 20 years from now, 10 years from now. And I had invested so much money already. So maybe wait a while. One little example. Some 30 years ago, I personally tried to send a satellite phone to our people in the mountains of Timor. It was a Portuguese diplomat, a Portuguese politician who got the money, $30,000 to buy a satellite phone the size of an attaché case. Difficult to hide it, but we managed to smuggle to the mountains. Few years later, maybe 2 or 3 years later, we got another one already costing only $7,000 and much smaller. Now you buy a iPhone in Hong Kong, I don't know, but if you go to China, you buy a genuine iPhone, it costs $900. And the gentleman in Shanghai, he told me this is $900, is new, is real. This one is fake, costs $100, $80. And because every niece of mine in Timor asked for iPhones, I bought them the $80. And they're all very happy, and has more application than the genuine one. Well, so that situation in one of the greatest achievements in my country is in reconciliation. In a country as profoundly traumatized with history of violence, you cannot move on without healing the wounds. And that's what we succeeded. And also healing the wounds, normalize the relation with Indonesia. One of the greatest success, I would say, in Asia, in terms of nations, countries at war, and then managed to overcome the history of the past and develop exceptional relations. And exceptional relations usually is among governments. In our case, government to government and people to people. Exceptional relations between the people of Timor-Leste and Indonesia. And you can see in day-to-day the way Timorese relate to Indonesia in my country. And the way Indonesians in Bali, in Georgia, in Jakarta relate to East Timorese. Zero problems with our people in Indonesia. I think maybe I move on to the other question. Sorry. No, there was another question I didn't answer.
So if I may, then we'll collect the next round of questions, if that's all right then. So the gentleman in the grey suit. Wonderful.
Thank you so much. Jean Berly at Education University. Thank you for your talk. I ask you a question on Africa. Because you go to Ghana, I was born in Togo. You don't remember maybe. So give your point of view because you saved Guinea-Bissau. Guinea-Bissau was in disorder and you were the representative of the United Nations. And since you went to Bissau, there is no military coup. So I congratulate you for that. And the president stayed in his office. Not like before. So what is your point about security in Africa? Because Africa is a very important continent. Thank you. And for China also, very important.
Let's come to 2 more last questions then. So sorry, just to be clear, the last round of questions. So gentleman in the front, Wilfred, and then Noah, and then I think that'll wrap us up. We might go a little bit over time if I can have the audience's kindness.
Robert Carroll, I'm a freelance international foreign correspondent. In September 99, when there was a referendum and the violence took place, I was the last reporter, and I reported for CNN, BBC, and Reuters, many people. So the place has a deep, deep place in my heart, East Timor, seriously. And this man, especially. Now, well, I would like a question that many people would possibly have not answered, or you haven't mentioned, that you were a candidate by Congress, and reported in this, for Secretary General of the United Nations. Now, I know you had to go home, for there was a crisis at home, but could you, what kind of Secretary General would you have been? I mean, did you think about that? I mean, you would have loved surely the role. You're a man of the world. You're a great statesman.
Thank you.
Secondarily, any other, just a couple other names of Angela Merkel. Similar, that's all. Good.
Thank you. And the last two questions, Noah, and then, yep. Winston, short questions, please.
Yes, Your Excellency, my name is Winston. I'm a PhD candidate at Hong Kong U. I just have a quick question on the polarization in politics, because there seems to be a perception that in the West and in Hong Kong, politics is increasingly divided, and the very legitimacy and validity of the opposition is being questioned. So my question is, how would you promote inclusive strategies in this increasingly polarized environment? Thank you.
One last question, if I can beg your forgiveness.
His Excellency, I'm Noah from GSIS. My question is, for a man who has suffered so much pain and sees such violence, what is your motivation? What drives you to remain peaceful, to promote peace? And what are the factors to still engage in dialogue, even if both parties hate each other so badly?
Thank you. If we may, sir, we'll go to 7:20.
I forgot to answer your question. My apologies. You mentioned about problems after independence, whether Africa or Asia, and then you mentioned about Myanmar. There is a lot of misperception or misinformation about Africa. It is a huge continent, as we know, 1 billion people. And I know from my basic experience, when I was lobbying for Timor-Leste, I went everywhere, and I, through the good grace, favor of some friendly countries in Africa, I was able to travel. And I remember going to Senegal in the 80s, Cote d'Ivoire, Mali, and today unrecognizable. Nigeria, in spite of all the problems you read about corruption, Boko Haram, and all of that, extraordinary changes since independence in terms of people, young generation of highly educated people who have contributed in transforming much of Africa. And remember, it is in Africa that you have some of the greatest resources in minerals. It's no accident that China is very actively present in Africa. China, like India, are resource poor, or resources that were there exhausted. So you need for industrialization, modernization, even for food supplies, you need African continent, as well as Latin America. China developed a strong relationship with Brazil, one of the biggest food suppliers in the world. Problems of violence, Congo, South Sudan, well, it happened in a far worse magnitude in Asia. Cambodia, only 40 years ago, the killing fields, and then now ongoing Myanmar, and still ongoing problems in southern Philippines, and the low-level, low-intensity conflict in southern Thailand. So ASEAN itself, which one of the most successful regional organizations anywhere in Asia or in the world, very sophisticated organization with capable people, is still affected by problems within ASEAN region, and the problem of Myanmar as well. The problem of Myanmar has really created serious divisions within ASEAN. If you follow the discussions in New York in the UN General Assembly just last year, for the first time, you saw at least 3 ASEAN countries, Indonesia, Brunei, Malaysia, voting with the resolution initiated by the Conference of Islamic Countries on Myanmar, while all the others abstained or voted against that resolution. So, and that first time, and not to mention the difference of understanding of the South China position among ASEAN countries. Like Cambodia does not follow the rest of ASEAN in relation to South China Sea. So some of the problems, divisions are still there, difficult to manage. And one question about the role of Timor-Leste in CPLP. CPLP is a community of Portuguese-speaking countries. It's made up 5 in Africa, Brazil, Portugal, and Timor-Leste, the only one in Southeast Asia. Our role is very limited in the sense that, through me, my country contributed to the peaceful resolution of the situation in Guinea-Bissau. When I was asked by Ban Ki-moon, after I left office, to go to Guinea-Bissau, I asked my compatriot, Shanana Guzmão, should I accept, should I go? He said, do go. We will support you. It's our small contribution to the UN, to Africa, that always stood with us. So I went. And it was Timor-Leste that gave the most financing to the electoral process in Guinea-Bissau, more than the European Union. The European Union contributed 2 million euros. Timor-Leste direct in cash $6 million, plus equipment, everything ran up to about 12 million, plus election experts that in record time, in 3 months, did register more than 96, 97% of the estimate voters in Guinea-Bissau. First time, voter registration was done electronically. We had a team of 20-something people, including one young Indonesian, part of our team. He was only 19 years old. He was the electronic IT expert in our team. And we have done election advice in Central African Republic. We did in São Tomé and Príncipe. But who at least partly trained our people in becoming, it was a gentleman from Mexico. He's still living in Timor. He was there first with the UN, and he's still there. Now probably he is not living Timor-Leste. And now a joke. And President Trump, very impressed with how the Timorese managed to stop Mexicans going to Timor-Leste. Because we have only one Mexican in Timor-Leste. And on top of it, I honor him when I was president for his long service in my country, more than 10 years, and now already 15 years in Timor-Leste. So he was the one, someone from a very distant country, training our people. And then he went with them to Guinea-Bissau, as he went to Central African Republic, he went to São Tomé, always accompanying our people. So that's the Timor-Leste contribution in the Portuguese-speaking community. You mentioned also about Myanmar, Aung San Suu Kyi, and I know it's a very controversial issue, and I have to say, do not demonize anyone, do not demonize Suu Kyi. She didn't create a problem, she inherited problem of 40 years, and as we know, in so many other situations, it's not black and white. And when people say Suu Kyi is the de facto leader, the de facto, is really she the de facto leader or the head of the armed forces? And if we talk to Suu Kyi, well, she will tell you more about the power that she has or doesn't have. And the military are watching her. She make a faux pas, within 2 days, 4 days, you will have hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating, demanding her ouster. Some people say she should resign if she doesn't agree with what the military are doing. She resigned, and then what? Well, sometimes we leaders have to think twice. I resign, and then what? What after me? Anyone then espousing my ideas, my ideals, I resign in protest because I don't agree with those. Well, then each of us resign, because it's not only she who has those convictions. So it's very disappointing for many, including Myanmar. But so that's it only illustrates the enormous complexity. It's easier, probably it was easier for Suu Kyi when she was under house arrest, when she was in Oxford. More difficult, including for us, on the ground to resolve daily problems of the people. What was that?
Questions about if you'd be the UN Secretary General, questions about...
Yeah, that's very kind of you, Robert, that I would be Secretary General of the UN. It was talked about in 2005. I was approached, I was interviewed, but I never took it seriously. Probably I would be vetoed, not by one country, only by 2 or 3. Second, I really, you have to understand the limits of your knowledge, your capacity, and I didn't think I would be able to manage it. And when I watched Secretary General Antonio Guterres today, I said, God, I wouldn't want to be in his position. And but my primary responsibility back then was my country. We just been independent 3-4 years. And how could I dream higher? So that was, it was only the kindness of people in New York and Washington and Portugal that thought I could be Secretary General of the UN. Next life, I might be, because I, like Buddhists, I believe in reincarnation. And,
So then the next question, the last two. How to manage political polarization? And how did you find the strength for peace?
for your question, not only me, but I haven't met, some Timorese, like one particular Timorese. He is now our ambassador in Mozambique for several years now. He was a prisoner in Indonesia, in Timor. He showed me where he was in prison, the place. Very humble person. And I sent him first as consul in Kupang. He was our first consul in West Timor, Indonesia. Extraordinarily humble person. You talk to him, you wouldn't know that he was tortured for 7 years. He showed me where he and others were held. They couldn't even sit down. The only way to sleep is leaning on each other in that cubicle. 6, 7 people in a cubicle. And he harbored zero resentment towards Indonesians, and many others like that. And that comes, I guess, partly, what is the greater good that came to us? If occupation was the gravest injustice, then I also said many times, the greatest act of justice is that Indonesia agreed to leave and the international community contributed to a resolution of the Timor problem. When people criticize the United States, because Kissinger and Gerald Ford were in Jakarta December 6, 1975, December 7, 1975, Indonesia invaded. And US complicity went on for years and years. Then came Bill Clinton. From day one, he began to do incremental changes in US approach to the Timor problem. If it were not for Bill Clinton intervention, and he was not only one, but there are many other people, including current Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, Prime Minister of Portugal. But if it were not for Bill Clinton standing there, probably we wouldn't get a resolution. Of course, there was change also in Indonesia. Students went to the streets, protested against the economic crisis, corruption in Indonesia. Suharto was ousted. So we say, a grave injustice was done to the people of Timor. This injustice has been corrected by everybody. There is a new Indonesia. We honor our victims. We look after our victims. We are not going to demand compensation from Indonesia. Indonesia has to take care of its victims. We take care of our victims. And we started a process of national healing and the recognition of the heroes, dead and alive, recognition and support to the victims, to the survivors, and to the veterans of the fight. And our people responded magnificently, very well. And to end, just one example. President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono came to Timor-Leste as soon as he was inaugurated in his first term. Because I knew him, I was foreign minister at the time, I volunteered to be the minister in attendance, meaning I had to accompany him 18 hours, except when he went to sleep. But all day long, I was with him. And he wanted to visit our cemetery, where many Timorese were buried following Indonesian invasion and the violence in 1999. Next door was the Indonesian military university, military cemetery. Next door, just 1 minute away. I told the president, President, Indonesian cemetery is right there. We need not get into the car, let's just walk. In the meantime, a whole crowd was being formed, generated. Indonesian security was becoming nervous. I knew there was no problem. And the people came, all wanted to shake Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono's hands. Zero problem. And then from there we went to our national parliament. The unfortunate situation in Timor-Leste is you have the parliament on this side of the road and university right in front. The students don't even need 10-cent bus fare to organize demonstrations. Right there. So I told the president, I said, President, we have this stupid arrangement whereby someone decided to have the parliament right in front of the university. God, the students just need to come out of the classes, and that's what they do. They do often. I told the president. So when we get there, we get out of the car. Don't walk straight to the parliament. Turn around and greet the students. So that's what he did, and he did in Bahasa. Selamat pagi, in Bahasa Indonesia, and everybody erupted in Selamat pagi. Extraordinary atmosphere. And then I sent a text message to some brilliant, quote unquote, senior official from the UN, who didn't agree with Timor-Leste approach in reconciliation, no international justice. I don't mention his name, but in the SMS I said, so-and-so, if you wanted a referendum on our policies of reconciliation and no special tribunal, you had it today in the streets of Dili. The people spontaneously came to the street to greet Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono. So that's our, And I think I end here in relation to your question. Yeah, of course, some people are angry. You know, my mother, she passed away recently. She survived 2 wars. Japanese occupation of Timor. We were invaded, occupied by Timor. She survived. Then survived Indonesian occupation in the mountains for years. She was always upset because she lost 3 children, my sister and 2 brothers. And in front of me or Shanana, she doesn't say anything. But when she talked with my nephews, nieces, and others, she badmouthed me and Shanana's mouth. These 2 characters are gutless. But she's a simple person, and she speaks as a mother. And there are many like that. But overall, people understand and support our policies. And as Indonesia respond in this statesmanship-like attitude towards Timor, accepting our independence and supporting us every way they can to help stabilize the country. For Indonesian universities, do not charge Timorese students international fee. Timorese students pay only domestic Indonesian fee. We have thousands of Timorese students there. They would not be able to study in Indonesia if they had to pay foreign student fee. So that's how our relationship.
So thank you very much. Can you all please join me thanking His Excellency? It was a wonderful session. Thank you. Thank you very much. And we'll just take...
Thank you.
You can just come up. So just take one quick photo. If you want to remove the microphone, we'll just take one quick photograph.
I take it out?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you. And we'll take one quick photograph. Sorry, Will, we'll just go in front of the desk, if you don't mind.
Okay, thank you so much for that wonderful discussion that I think we've all taken a lot away from. And so just like to thank you for spending time with us at the University of Hong Kong and best wishes for your travels. Thank you.